know that countless cyber attacks are launched every day, each one capable of manipulating public perception and causing chaos in our digital landscape? But cyber attacks aren't just about data breaches. They are also about influence and control. Good evening, my name is Maia Mazurkiewicz, and welcome to the Anatomy of Disinformation. There are various ways to influence public opinion and change the attitudes of people. It can be done through cyber attacks, but stoking fear and leaking data. But it can also be done through the buyout of strategic assets by foreign actors. And media is one example of an asset that has enormous influence on people. Cybersecurity remains a critical concern, especially as attacks increasingly target public trust and national stability, but also our personal security and our businesses. But who is behind these attacks? And how can we defend ourselves against them? To discuss this, I'm joined by an expert on the very front lines of cybersecurity.
Bryson Bort, founder of SCYTHE. Bryson Bort is the founder of SCYTHE, a startup building a next-generation threat emulation platform, and GRIM, a cybersecurity consultancy. He's a co-founder of the ICS Village, a no-profit advancing awareness of industrial control system security. Mr. Bort is also a senior fellow at the National Security Institute, USMA EECS ABN Advisory Board member at the US Military Academy's Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science, and adjunct senior technical advisor for the Institute of Security and Technology. He is recognized as a top 50 in cyber by Business Insider, Security Executive Finalist of the Year by SC Media, was awarded Tech Titan twice, and is the 2023 SANS Difference Maker Award winner for Innovator of the Year.
Bryson, welcome. Thank you for joining us straight from Florida today. We're going to be discussing today about cybersecurity and disinformation. And I have a first question to you. As we are just finished the electoral campaign in US, how cyber attacks have been present in the sphere?
Yeah, the most recent cyber attack that we've been talking about this year is called Salt Typhoon. And yes, they have these kinds of funny names, but the actions are not funny. In this case, there was a compromise of the communications infrastructure throughout the United States, specifically seeming to target the election campaigns of both parties. And that included being able to pull text messages and record and share phone calls from senior officials.
Do you know who was behind that?
That one in particular with the name Salt Typhoon is being attributed to the Chinese government. We have also seen activities from the Iranian and the Russian governments.
In these elections, right? And how it's different, because there were several cyber attacks also in the previous campaigns. How does it different the response or the ways of the attacks this year and the previous times?
Yeah, so to set for the viewers, the origin that Maya is talking about goes back to 2016, which was spearheaded by a hacker called Guccifer. And it's interesting because that was attributed to the Russian government. And I have a background in intelligence and cyber operations. And there was kind of always an agreement on what was inbounds and what was out of bounds. And what we saw in 2016, they got caught. And it was interesting because we saw a strategic pause on their behalf as they were like, oh my goodness, we've been they what do we do? And they
didn't expect it, right?
Well, nobody expected it. And what's interesting about that is when they got caught, they stopped, but then they didn't see a strong response. So they started back up again. And here we are 8 years later. But what was interesting, because the big thing that came out of that one was the release of thousands of documents from the Democratic Party, which the press, of course, was complicit in sharing that. And in this case, we just had an incident a couple of months ago where the Republican campaign was hacked. And the press now said, hey, we're not going to publish that because we no longer want to support this kind of behavior. So we have a very different response from the press.
Would you think that it's good? That should be the response of the press that would happen this year?
I think it's difficult because the press has a responsibility, but one of the challenges we have here is we're talking about disinformation is what information that's being released here is accurate. We can't take for granted that somebody with an ulterior motive is releasing everything without changing it, and that's hard to figure out. I think overall, it's probably better that the press does not work with hackers because it does, and it's like paying terrorists. You're engaging a future function that's going to come back and bite you.
And did it change in terms of the actors? Because you've said about one hacker the previous time, and this time I understand it was a more severe influence operation?
Right. So influence operations is slightly separate than what we were talking about, right? Cyber attacks are where I'm actually going onto a computer. I am pulling out information. I'm pulling data. I am intercepting phone calls and recording that audio. Influence operations are where we're trying to, it's the evolution of propaganda. How do we shape public opinion or take advantage of fault lines that are in society? Because so much of that's what social media is. It's not just around how do we build personal connections with our families and our friends, but it's now a way that a lot of the younger generations, in fact, get their news. And
in terms of the cyber or the outcome of both, is it both regarding the trust building and trust issue, or the cyber attacks are also having like the outer motive?
Well, so this both have ulterior motives, right? I'm hacking your information because I want to embarrass you. I want to pull out things that are going to work against you. And in influence operations, it's similar. We are taking advantage typically of more negative psychologies to influence an outcome that supports our goal.
And when we are talking still right now about cyber attacks, we are talking about the national security, but also very often those that are targeted are businesses, correct? Where we can see that in the business. Do you have any specific cases that you can describe and show?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the things that makes cybersecurity a different discipline. In traditional business, the most you have to worry about when it comes to crime would be simple fraud inside with your accountants, or potentially the masked man coming in and trying to rob you. Cybersecurity changes that paradigm because the masked man that tries to rob you could be all the way around the world trying to do it. I like to go back to a keynote presentation that then director of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, Chris Krebs and I gave at RSA in 2020, right before COVID. And we talked about the coming scourge as a national security threat of ransomware, because private industry is a part of national security. And what we've seen with ransomware, I think, is fascinating.
So what you've seen, yeah.
Yeah, so what I've seen. So first, the ecosystem itself is not monolithic. You have different groups that specialize in different parts. The folks that focus on breaking in, the folks that build the tools, and then the folks that actually conduct the operations and hold the business for ransom and try to get the payment back.
And they are coming into the same businesses? It doesn't matter which kind of business they are just about those areas, right?
Well, it's both. So you can have the ransomware, which is opportunistic of you are just a business that doesn't have what you would think would be important to a national security level, and they just got you. The ones that we've seen in Europe, particularly after the war in Ukraine started in 2022, was you saw a marked shift away from American businesses and targeting energy businesses that would support European independence on Russian energy. And that was prominent in 22 and 23. So you see both the pure criminal element, and then you see ones that tie to a national security outcome, which clearly would be state sanctions or state sponsored. The other one that we've seen this year that's huge was called Change Healthcare. So this is a large health insurance provider, and there was two aspects to this. The ransomware aspect, which I think every one of our listeners should be very concerned about, was when we're talking about health, there were services that were down at hospitals and local physicians. And while you can't directly attribute that this service going down meant that this patient potentially died, there is absolutely a correlation between a delay in service and an increase in what we would call comorbidity. So while there's not hack equals death, there is a direct correlation between some of the impact of these attacks and patients dying. And then the other part was the release of all of their personal information. So we have personal identifiable information, like what is unique to you, but even more critical than that is personal health information, your records, your health, because those are things you can't change. And we had 100 million records in that breach that were distributed and stolen.
Bryson, thank you so much for describing in details cyber attacks and cyber threats. Thank you for joining us. Why are women in politics so often targeted by disinformation? Darina Onyszko sheds light on this strategy and its impacts on young activists.
Boxing a woman! Hey, hey, no! Hey, hey,
We're seeing really that disinformation is used as a weapon against women in politics, as well as against other groups, not only in politics, but as well as civil society. We're as well seeing growing the populism, for example, and far-right support in terms of youth specifically. We've seen this in different elections, starting from the European Parliament this summer to more recently in Germany in local state elections.
We have primarily won with young people, not just in this election in Brandenburg, but in all elections.
Or even in Austria, where for the first time since the Second World War, we've seen the rise of far-right. With all of this, I think we really need to support young women and young people in generally in terms of their critical thinking and providing them more media literacy training. Young women are disproportionately affected by disinformation, misinformation campaigns, online hate speech. Quite a lot of young women and youth in general start with campaigns for local political office that are generally not as popular among the population audiences, media. We see an example in the organization that I as well represent, European Democracy Youth Network, where we have more than 700 right now young activists and politicians. We have some of those as well in parliaments in Central and Eastern Europe. And those young women who are elected are just saying so many stories, sharing them of how much hate they endure, also because they are women, especially online, when we have these spaces much less regulated, social media platforms like TikTok or X. Former Slovak president Zuzana Čaputová, who also endured quite a lot of hateful campaigns against her during her political office, and as well as death threats. And one of the reasons when she was deciding not to run again for political office, she said that her family had to be her priority, and it's because of this hate she just couldn't want to expose her family to that again.
Любимые мои молдаване.
Maia Sandu, deepfakes created against her and with the use of artificial intelligence, for example. And in this election, they were shared by her political adversaries with very clear links that research says to us that they were linked to Russia and Kremlin. When women represent more pro-democracy forces, Maia Sandu is just one of the examples. Zuzana Čaputová also was. We've seen that Kremlin is one of those perpetrators and create disinformation campaigns. Women represent those pro-democracy forces, and this is what Kremlin doesn't want. They don't want democracy to win, neither in Europe or in my own country, Ukraine, where we're seeing so many women stepping up in civil society, being activists, or as government representatives in different ministries. For example, in the ministry of related to the European integration of Ukraine is led by a woman right now. And then just women represent quite a lot of parties that are pro-European Union, that are pro-democracy, against authoritarianism. There is more and more issues in terms of gender equality as well, even in our more developed societies. And this is something that can be used by those forces like Kremlin, for example, just playing on those stereotypes that maybe women are not powerful enough, they are not supposed to be holding those positions.
Now, let's take a look at instances in which cyber threats have intersected with public events, exerting enormous influence on narratives, not only through the use of social media, but also traditional media. Media ownership is increasingly a tool of influence, especially as countries like China invest in foreign media markets.
Magda Jakubowska, Vice President of the Res Publica Foundation. Magda Jakubowska is an expert on strategic foresight and program planning, institutional cooperation and strategic development, and looking at the EU and transatlantic affairs through the lens of democratic security. One of her flagship projects concerns women empowerment in security. Previously, she worked at the Center for European Policy Analysis and the Polish Institute of International Affairs.
Magda, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be discussing mostly about foreign buyout of media in the world, but also of how that affects the attitudes of people. And I would like to first ask you about the Beijing media offensive, so-called, that started in Slovakia.
Thank you, Maia, for having me. Yes, this is not only the Beijing offensive in Slovakia, but overall global one. Slovakia has been very fragile. You know, it was a moment when Beijing found its way in Slovakia to kind of enter the EU market.
Around the pandemic time, right?
Around the pandemic time, exactly. Slovakia has been over the pandemic quite intensely touched upon, and also this economical factor, especially with trade. Slovakia is, of course, well known for car manufacturing, also parts of cars, and we know this market has been completely shut down during the pandemics. So this was the kind of a way to enter the EU via this fragile small country.
So it was like based on business or on the security more?
It was the entry point was business and a kind of trying to help and support Slovakia in those hard days, but not only. This has been a very thorough diplomatic action. It was the embassy of Beijing of China to be kind of influencing the media, some narratives.
Both social media and traditional media?
Both, but traditional media has been specifically targeted because, of course, in this small country, it is not easy. It is not easy overall for the traditional media to stay in the mainstream because it's very expensive. It requires to put a lot of money and effort to kind of keep the traditional media up and running. So in this very small country as Slovakia is, it is even more difficult to have those mainstream media working and staying, of course, not influenced by anyone.
Slovakia had a change of power recently. Have you been seeing that the media that were supported by Chinese government were somehow present in those communication?
Of course, this is not a direct thing, but the help of Chinese money for the mainstream media and kind of growing pro-Russian, pro-Chinese narratives influenced, of course, the saying of and the votes finally of the general public in this country. This is not only the case of Slovakia, we can see it in Serbia, for example, or in Hungary.
And in terms of the narratives, both Russian and Chinese ones are similar? Are they cooperating, so-called, on this level?
Yes and no. Some are very specific for Chinese narratives. I mean, more of economic questions, how much, such countries as Slovakia or Hungary need this development that Chinese can offer, or Chinese products that are cheaper or can be, delivered in almost no time. These narratives are dominating in that sense. Pro-Russian narratives are more directed now, especially towards the question of EU, so anti-Western typically. And the question of Ukraine and war in Ukraine.
And coming into this narrative of Ukraine especially, in Poland, recently CBOS has published a poll that said that support of Poles towards the Ukrainian refugees has dropped significantly, from 94% in February 2022 to 53% recently. How that could have happened?
Well, to some extent, of course, we could await this change, this kind of tiredness of migrants being present in Poland, and so on and so forth. We had a larger research into this case, specifically on the narratives that are in the mainstream media and that are anti-Ukrainian. So, for example, they underline that they have issues with the Ukrainians being included in health insurance or healthcare system in Poland. We already had long queues to any doctor's appointment. Now it's even more so.
So it's like homogenic country and having a bit of a crisis, and now trying to find a scapegoat, right?
It kind of you look for reasons why your life is not that great, and this is one of the reasons. Some of our taxes and benefits are directed to Ukrainians, to the kids at school, to mothers and so on, like 500 plus, this typical benefit. Now it's 800 plus now. The typical benefit that Ukrainian mothers were also awarded. This kind of, you can see that the narratives tell the general public in Poland, they kind of try to play on this kind of unfairness. Mm-hmm. Why? These are my taxes, why should I give it away to Ukrainians?
And very much targeted in our emotions as well, right?
Very much, very much. So this is kind of this personal interests part, but this is not only this is also those economical questions. The question of grains and food products from Ukraine.
I have a question. Can we do anything about that?
Well, we can try to explain that and kind of elevate the narratives that say that it is important that we have those people around us, that this is not only, of course, this humanitarian, heartfelt reaction to war and to the newcomers, the influx of migrants from Ukraine is one thing, but we could expect it will die out a little. And now it is important to elevate those narratives that we need those hands to work. We need those people to kind of help us thrive and help Poland economy be in a better suited position.
And it's very much about our personal and national security. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, let's take a closer look at what we mean when we talk about cyber attacks.
What are cyber attacks and how do they relate to disinformation campaigns? A cyber attack is any intentional effort to disrupt, manipulate, or compromise data, applications, or digital assets by unauthorized access. This includes attempts to steal, expose, alter, disable, or destroy information systems, often to achieve malicious goals such as spreading confusion, influencing public opinion, or disrupting normal operations. Cyber attacks can also serve as tools in broader disinformation campaigns, where digital manipulation is combined with misinformation to polarize, mislead, or exploit targeted audiences.
Cyber threats and media influence are redefining the way we interact with information, often in subtle but significant ways. It's essential that we remain informed and alert. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep calm and think deeply.